It was a bright and sunny Saturday morning. The kind of day where everything feels calm and happy. Jake Miller sat on his front porch with a big cup of coffee in his hand. He liked sitting there, listening to the birds chirping all around him. A soft breeze blew through the air, making the leaves on the trees wiggle just a little. The smell of fresh green grass floated up to his nose, and it made him smile. Jake loved days like this. They were simple and peaceful, just the way he liked things. Jake had lived in this little neighborhood for a long time, years and years. It was a quiet place with small houses all lined up in neat rows. The streets were clean, and most people were friendly. Kids rode their bikes up and down the sidewalks, laughing and shouting. Neighbors waved to each other when they passed by. It was a nice spot to call home, and Jake fit right in. He wasn't loud or bossy. He didn't cause trouble. He just kept to himself, minding his own business. Most folks in the neighborhood liked him just fine. They'd say, "Oh, that's Jake. He's a good guy. Never bothers anyone." But not everyone thought Jake was so great. Oh no, there was one person who didn't like him at all. Her name was Karen Wilson, and she was trouble with a capital T. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the HOA queen. Now, if you don't know what HOA means, it's short for Homeowners Association. That's a group of people who make rules for the neighborhood, like what color your house can be or how tall your grass can grow. Karen loved those rules more than anything. She carried the HOA rulebook everywhere she went, holding it up like it was some kind of magic wand. To her, that book gave her power over everyone else. Karen wasn't quiet like Jake. She had a loud voice that could wake up the whole street. When she talked, it was like a big horn blasting in your ears. And her eyes? They were sharp, always looking around for something to complain about. She walked up and down the neighborhood every single day, watching everyone like a hawk. If your mailbox was a tiny bit crooked, Karen would notice. If you left your trash can out too long, Karen would write you a nasty note. She acted like she owned the whole place, like she was the boss of every house, every yard, and every person. Everyone knew Karen. You couldn't miss her. She wore bright clothes that made her stand out, and she always had that rulebook tucked under her arm. The neighbors would whisper about her when she wasn't around. "Here comes Karen again," they'd say, rolling their eyes. "What's she mad about this time?" Kids would run inside when they saw her coming, because they knew she'd yell if they were too loud. Even the dogs seemed to hide when Karen marched by. She was like a storm cloud on a sunny day, big, loud, and ready to ruin everything. Jake had seen Karen plenty of times. She'd walk past his house, glaring at his porch or his lawn, looking for something to pick on. Most days, he just ignored her. He'd sip his coffee and let her grumble to herself. He didn't like fighting or arguing. That wasn't his way. But Karen? She didn't care if you ignored her. She'd keep going until she got what she wanted or until she found someone else to bother. Jake knew she was trouble, but he never thought she'd come after him. Not like this. Not on a peaceful Saturday morning when all he wanted was to enjoy his coffee. But that's exactly what was about to happen. See, this wasn't just any ordinary day. It started out normal, sure, birds singing, breeze blowing, coffee steaming in Jake's cup. But something big was hiding under the surface. Something Karen didn't see coming. Jake wasn't just some quiet guy sitting on his porch. Oh no, he had a secret. A big one. And it was the kind of secret that could turn everything upside down, especially for someone like Karen. Let's paint the picture a little more so you can really see it. Jake's house was small but cozy. It had white walls and a red roof, with a little porch out front. That porch was his favorite spot. He'd put a comfy chair there, one with soft cushions that hugged you when you sat down. Every morning, he'd come out with his coffee mug, a big blue one with a smiley face on it, and settle in. He'd watch the world wake up, slow and easy. The sun would climb higher in the sky, turning everything golden. Squirrels would scamper across the grass, chasing each other up the trees. It was Jake's little slice of calm in a busy world. The neighborhood stretched out around him, all neat and tidy. The houses were close together, but not too close. Each one had a small yard with flowers or bushes. Some had swing sets where kids played after school. The street was smooth and clean, perfect for bike rides or walks. People moved through their day mowing lawns, washing cars, chatting over fences. It was the kind of place where nothing big ever happened. Or so everyone thought. Karen lived just a few houses down from Jake. Her place was easy to spot. She had a big sign in her yard that said HOA President in bold black letters. Her grass was always cut perfectly, not a blade out of place. Her flowers stood in straight rows, like soldiers on parade. Everything about her house screamed rules. She wanted everyone else's house to look just like hers, perfect, boring, and exactly the same. If your house didn't match her idea of right, she'd let you know. Loudly. That Saturday morning, Jake wasn't thinking about Karen at first. He was too busy enjoying the sunshine. His coffee was hot, and he took small sips, letting it warm him up. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a second. The birds kept singing their happy little songs. A dog barked somewhere down the street, but it was a friendly bark, not a mean one. Everything felt good. Everything felt right. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Loud ones. They clomped down the sidewalk, getting closer and closer. Jake opened his eyes and peeked over the edge of his porch. There she was, Karen Wilson, marching straight toward him. Her bright red shirt glowed in the sunlight, and her face was scrunched up like she'd just bitten a lemon. That rule book was in her hand, flapping as she walked. Jake's stomach sank a little. He knew that look. Karen was on a mission, and he had a feeling he was the target. She stopped right at the edge of his yard, planting her feet like she was claiming the ground. Her sharp eyes darted around, looking for something to yell about. Jake stayed quiet, watching her. He took another sip of his coffee, slow and steady. He HOA queen who patrolled the streets like she owned them. Everyone knew her loud voice, sharp eyes, and a rulebook she waved like a weapon. "Hey, Karen," he said, nice and calm. "What's up?" But Karen didn't answer. She was too busy glaring at something on his porch. That something? A little blue rug. Jake had put it there to wipe his shoes when he came inside. It wasn't fancy, just a plain mat, soft and simple. But to Karen, it was a crime. She pointed at it like it was a monster. "That rug," she shouted, her voice booming. "It's ugly. It breaks the HOA rules. You can't have that here." Jake raised an eyebrow, still sipping his coffee. He didn't say much. He just watched her, waiting to see what she'd do next. Karen didn't wait long. She pulled out her phone and started dialing. "I'm calling the police," she yelled. "This is an emergency. You're ruining the neighborhood." Jake almost laughed, but he kept his face straight. He knew Karen was serious. She loved calling people cops, the HOA board, anyone who'd listen. It was her favorite thing to do when she didn't get her way. But here's the part nobody saw coming, not even Karen. Jake wasn't worried. Not one bit. He sat there, cool as a cucumber, while she ranted and raved. Why? Because Jake had a secret. A big, juicy secret that was about to make Karen's day a whole lot worse. What was it? Oh, you'll see. This story's just getting started, and trust me, it's gonna be good. So, what do you think Jake's secret is? Stick around, because things are about to get wild. Have you ever had a neighbor like Karen? Someone who thinks they're in charge of everything? Drop a yes or no in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from today. If you like stories like this, hit that subscribe button. I've got more coming your way. It was still that sunny Saturday morning, and Jake Miller was sitting on his porch with his coffee. Everything was nice and quiet until Karen Wilson showed up. Oh boy, here she came, stomping up the sidewalk like she was the queen of the whole world. Her bright red shirt made her look like a big, angry tomato, and her face was all scrunched up. She wasn't happy, not one bit. In her hand, she held her phone, gripping it tight like it was her best friend. She was ready to use it, and Jake could tell she was itching to call someone. Karen stopped right in front of Jake's little house. She planted her feet on the ground, standing tall like she owned the place. Her sharp eyes zoomed in on something small, something blue. It was the rug on Jake's porch. That little blue mat wasn't fancy or special. Jake had put it there so he could wipe his shoes before going inside. It was soft and plain, just a helpful thing to keep his floors clean. But to Karen? Oh no, that rug was trouble. Big trouble. She pointed at it with her finger, jabbing the air like she was poking a bear. "That rug on your porch," she barked. Her voice was loud, so loud it made the birds stop singing for a second. "It's an eyesore. It's ugly. It breaks all the HOA rules, and I'm reporting you. She waved her phone around as she yelled, like it was a magic wand that could make Jake disappear. Karen loved the HOA rules more than anything. To her, they were the most important thing in the world. And if you didn't follow them, watch out, she'd come after you. Jake didn't jump up or yell back. Nope, he stayed right where he was, sitting in his comfy chair. He smiled a little, calm as could be. "Morning, Karen," he said, nice and slow. His voice was soft, like a whisper compared to her shouting. He lifted his coffee mug to his lips and took a sip slow and easy, like he had all the time in the world. "You sure about that?" he asked, tilting his head just a tiny bit. He wasn't mad. He wasn't scared. He was just Jake. But Karen? She didn't even hear him. She was too busy being loud and angry. Her fingers flew over her phone, tapping the numbers fast. 9-1-1. That's right, she was calling the police. Over a rug. She held the phone up to her ear and started talking before anyone even answered. "Hello? Yes, this is an emergency," she shouted. "There's a man here ruining the neighborhood with an ugly rug. It's on his porch, and it's against the rules. You need to come right now." She kept going, ranting and raving about how Jake's little blue mat was the worst thing she'd ever seen. "It's ruining everything," she cried. "The whole street looks bad because of him." Jake watched her, still sipping his coffee. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Karen thought she had him cornered, just like she always did with everyone else. She was used to winning. She'd yell, she'd call someone, and people would give in. They'd take down their wrong decorations or fix their messy yards just to make her stop. Karen loved that power. She loved being the boss. And right now, she thought Jake was just another neighbor she could scare into doing what she wanted. But here's the thing, Jake wasn't scared. Not even a little. Karen didn't know it yet, but he wasn't sweating this at all. He sat there, cool as a cucumber, while she waved her phone and shouted into it. Why wasn't he worried? Because Jake had dealt with worse than Karen. Way worse. She was loud, sure, but she wasn't the toughest problem he'd ever faced. And more than that, he had something up his sleeve. Something big. Something Karen didn't see coming. Let's slow down and look at this moment a little closer. Picture it, Jake on his porch, leaning back in his chair. His coffee mug was warm in his hands, and the steam curled up into the air. The sun was shining bright, making everything look golden. His little blue rug sat there on the porch floor, minding its own business. It wasn't hurting anyone. It wasn't even dirty, just a clean, simple mat. But to Karen, it was like a giant monster attacking her perfect neighborhood. Karen stood on the sidewalk, just a few steps away. Her red shirt glowed in the sunlight, and her face was getting redder too. She was mad, really, really mad. Her voice bounced off the houses, so loud that a dog down the street started barking back. She kept pointing at the rug, then at Jake, then at the rug again. "You can't have that here," she yelled. "It's against the rules. I'm in charge of this neighborhood, and I say it has to go." She sounded like a teacher scolding a kid who broke a big rule. But Jake wasn't a kid, and he wasn't breaking anything important. Neighbors started to peek out. Across the street, Mrs. Jenkins opened her curtains just a little and looked out her window. Down the block, Mr. Carter stepped onto his porch, scratching his head. They could hear Karen's shouting from inside their houses. They knew her voice anywhere. "Oh no," Mrs. Jenkins whispered to herself. "What's Karen mad about now?" Mr. Carter shook his head and mumbled, "She's at it again." Everyone in the neighborhood had seen Karen do this before. She'd march around, yelling about something small like a mailbox that wasn't the right color or a bush that was too tall. But calling the police over a rug? That was new, even for her. Jake could feel the eyes on him. He knew people were watching. But he didn't care. He just kept sitting there, calm and quiet. He took another sip of his coffee, letting the warm drink slide down his throat. "Karen," he said again, still nice and soft, "you sure you want to do this?" His voice was steady, like he was asking her what she wanted for lunch. But Karen wasn't listening. She was too busy talking to the 911 person on the phone. "Yes, it's an emergency," she said again. "He's breaking the rules, and I need you here now. The person on the other end must have said something, because Karen got even louder. No, I'm not joking, she snapped. This is serious. The neighborhood is falling apart because of people like him. She glared at Jake, her eyes like little lasers trying to zap him. She thought she had him trapped. She thought the police would show up, take one look at that rug, and tell Jake to get rid of it. In her mind, she was the hero saving the street from a terrible crime. She'd win, just like always. But Jake? He wasn't moving. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't even frowning. He just smiled a little more, like he knew something she didn't. And he did. Oh, he definitely did. Karen thought she was the smartest person around, but she was missing something big. Jake wasn't just some guy who liked coffee and quiet mornings. He had a trick hidden away, a secret that was going to change everything. Can you guess what he was hiding? What could make a guy like Jake so calm when Karen was yelling her head off? Let's think about Karen for a second. She wasn't new to this. She'd been bossing people around for years. If your grass grew too long, she'd knock on your door with that rulebook and tell you to fix it. If you painted your fence a color she didn't like, she'd leave a note saying it was against the rules. She even told little Timmy down the street that his lemonade stand was illegal because he didn't have a permit. Karen loved being in charge. It made her feel big and important. And most people just let her do it. They didn't want the trouble. They'd sigh, roll their eyes, and do what she said to keep the peace. But Jake wasn't most people. He didn't jump when she yelled. He didn't run inside to hide. He just sat there, watching her like she was putting on a funny show. His calmness made Karen even madder. She wasn't used to this. People were supposed to listen to her. They were supposed to say, yes, Karen, and fix whatever she didn't like. But Jake? He wasn't playing her game. And that drove her crazy. She stomped her foot on the ground, still holding the phone. You'll see, she shouted at him. The police are coming, and they're going to make you take that ugly rug away. You can't break the rules and get away with it. She crossed her arms, smirking like she'd already won. In her head, it was all over. The cops would pull up, side with her, and Jake would have to obey. That's how it always went. Right? Wrong. Jake leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs out a little. He looked at Karen with that same small smile. Okay, he said, super casual. If you say so. He didn't sound worried. He didn't sound mad. He sounded fine. Like nothing she said could shake him. And that's because nothing could. Jake had seen bigger problems than Karen and her loud voice. He'd faced tougher fights than a silly rug argument. And that secret he was hiding? It was like a shield, keeping him safe from all her noise. Karen didn't notice how calm he was. She was too busy feeling proud of herself. She thought she was winning. She thought she was in control. But she wasn't. Not this time. Jake's secret was like a bomb waiting to go off, a quiet one that she wouldn't hear until it was too late. What could it be? Why wasn't he scared of her yelling or her 911 call? Something was up, and it was going to turn this whole morning upside down. The tension was building, like a storm cloud getting bigger and darker. Karen kept talking into her phone, telling the police to hurry up. Yes, it's right here on Maple Street, she said. You'll see the house with the awful rug. It's a disgrace. She paced back and forth on the sidewalk, her shoes clomping loud against the concrete. She was sure she had Jake right where she wanted him. But Jake? He just kept sipping his coffee. The birds started singing again, like they didn't care about Karen's shouting. The breeze blew softly, rustling the leaves. The neighborhood stayed quiet, except for her voice cutting through the air. Jake watched her, his eyes steady and sharp. He wasn't sweating it. He wasn't nervous. He'd dealt with worse than Karen Wilson, and he knew something she didn't. Something big. Something that was going to make her wish she'd never walked up to his porch that morning. So, what do you think Jake's hiding? Why's he so chill while Karen's losing her mind? Stick around, because this story's about to get even better. The minutes kept ticking by, slow and steady, like the hands on a clock going round and round. Karen Wilson stood on the sidewalk in front of Jake Miller's house, her arms crossed tight. She had a big smirk on her face, a smug little grin that said she thought she'd won already. She was waiting for the police to show up, sure they'd take her side. In her mind, they'd roll in, see that little blue rug on Jake's porch, and tell him to get rid of it. She'd be the hero, and Jake would be the loser. That's how she saw it, anyway. Jake didn't say a peep. He didn't argue or yell back like Karen wanted him to. Nope, he just leaned back in his comfy porch chair, stretching his legs out a little. His coffee mug sat in his hands, still warm from the hot drink inside. He watched Karen like she was putting on a funny show, like a clown at a circus, hopping around and making noise. His eyes stayed on her, calm and steady, while she huffed and puffed. He wasn't mad. He wasn't scared. He was just watching. The neighborhood wasn't so quiet anymore. Karen's loud voice had woken it up. Neighbors started peeking out their windows, pulling back curtains just a tiny bit to see what was going on. Mrs. Jenkins, who lived across the street, pushed her glasses up her nose and squinted out at Jake's porch. Down the block, Mr. Carter stuck his head out his front door, scratching his gray hair. Little Timmy, the kid with the lemonade stand, pressed his face against his bedroom window, his eyes big and round. They could all hear Karen shouting about that rug, and they were curious. What was she up to now? They'd seen Karen pull stunts like this before. Oh yes, she was famous for it. One time, she yelled at Mr. Carter because his trash can was out on the curb 5 minutes past pickup time. Another day, she marched up to Mrs. Jenkins' house and complained that her lawn wasn't mowed short enough. It's against the rules. Karen had barked, waving her HOA rulebook like it was a magic stick. The neighbors were used to her fits, her big, loud tantrums about silly things. But this? Calling the police over a little blue rug? That was next level silly, even for Karen. They whispered to each other, their voices soft so she wouldn't hear. She's lost it this time, Mrs. Jenkins muttered. A rug? Really? Mr. Carter shook his head. She's gone too far. Karen didn't notice the whispers. She didn't care who was watching. She stood there, tall and proud, her phone still in her hand from when she'd called 911. She kept that smirk on her face, glancing at Jake every few seconds like she was daring him to fight back. You'll see, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The cops are coming, and they're gonna make you take that ugly thing down. You can't break my rules and get away with it. She pointed at the rug again, her finger shaking a little from how mad she was. To her, that mat was a giant problem, like a monster ruining her perfect neighborhood. Jake didn't move. He didn't even blink much. He just sat there, sipping his coffee now and then, letting Karen talk herself silly. The sun was still shining bright, making the porch glow all warm and golden. The birds chirped again, like they decided Karen's noise wasn't worth hiding from. A soft breeze blew through, rustling the leaves on the trees. It was a peaceful day except for Karen, who was anything but peaceful. Jake watched her pace back and forth on the sidewalk, her shoes clomping loud against the concrete. She looked like a tiger in a cage, ready to pounce. But Jake? He was cool as a cucumber. Then, something odd happened. Really odd. A police car rolled up the street, slow and quiet. Its lights were off, no flashing red and blue, no loud siren. It was silent as a shadow, creeping along like it didn't want to be noticed. The car stopped right in front of Jake's house, parking smooth and easy. 2 officers stepped out, their boots hitting the ground with soft thuds. They were big guys, tall and strong, with serious faces. Their uniforms were dark blue, and their badges glinted in the sunlight. Everyone froze. Karen, Jake, the neighbors peeking out. A police car showing up wasn't something you saw every day on Maple Street. Karen's smirk got even bigger for a second. Ha, she said, spinning around to face the officers. See? I told you they'd come. You're in trouble now, Jake. She waved her phone at him, like it was proof she'd won. She thought the cops were there for her, there to back her up and tell Jake he was wrong. In her head, they'd march right over to his porch, point at that rug, and say, "Take it down, mister." She was so sure of it, she practically bounced on her toes. But here's where it gets weird. The officers didn't even glance at Jake. Not once. They didn't look at his porch or his little blue rug. Nope, they turned their heads and walked straight toward Karen. Their boots clicked on the sidewalk, steady and sure, as they got closer to her. Karen's smirk faded fast like someone had wiped it off her face with a rag. Her eyes got wide, and her mouth opened a little. "Wait, what's this?" she snapped, her voice sharp and confused. She waved her phone at the officers now, holding it up like a shield. "I called you about him," she said, pointing at Jake. "He's the one breaking the rules. Not me." The officers didn't stop. They kept walking, their faces blank and serious. They didn't say anything yet, just kept moving toward her. The neighbors gasped, their whispers getting louder. "What's happening?" Mrs. Jenkins said, leaning closer to her window. "Are they here for Karen?" Mr. Carter stepped out onto his porch, his eyebrows shooting up. Little Timmy giggled, pressing his hands against the glass. Something big was going on, and everyone could feel it. "Jake." He just grinned wider. His smile stretched across his face, slow and easy, like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. He set his coffee mug down on the little table next to his chair, letting it rest there. He leaned forward a tiny bit, resting his elbows on his knees, and watched the officers get closer to Karen. See, Jake had noticed something Karen hadn't. A little detail, small but huge, that was about to flip everything upside down. He'd seen it coming, and now it was here. His eyes sparkled a little, like he was in on a secret joke. And he was. Oh, he definitely was. Karen started to back up, her sneakers scuffing the sidewalk. "No, no, no," she said, her voice getting higher. "You've got it all wrong. I'm the one who called you. I'm the HOA president. He's the problem." She jabbed her finger at Jake again, her hand shaking now. She didn't understand. She couldn't figure out why the cops were looking at her instead of him. Her smirk was long gone, replaced by a frown that made her look like a kid who'd lost her favorite toy. The officers stopped just a few feet from her. One of them, a tall guy with short brown hair, put his hands on his hips. The other one, a bigger guy with a shaved head, crossed his arms. They stared at Karen, their eyes steady and calm. They didn't look mad or mean, just ready. Ready for what? That's what everyone wanted to know. The street went quiet again, so quiet you could hear the breeze whistling through the trees. Even the birds stopped chirping, like they were waiting to see what happened next. Jake leaned back in his chair again, picking up his coffee mug. He took another slow sip, his grin still there. He wasn't surprised. Not one bit. He'd known something Karen didn't, something that made this whole thing funny to him. What had he seen? What little detail had he caught that she'd missed? It was like a puzzle piece clicking into place, and Jake had the whole picture while Karen was still scrambling to find the edges. Let's think about it for a second. Karen had been so busy yelling and calling the police, she hadn't stopped to look around. She hadn't noticed anything strange. But Jake? He was quiet, sure, but he wasn't blind. He'd been watching, listening, paying attention. Maybe it was something he'd heard. Maybe it was something he'd seen earlier that morning or even days before. Whatever it was big enough to make him sit there, cool and calm, while Karen freaked out. It was big enough to bring those officers straight to her instead of him. The neighbors couldn't believe their eyes. Mrs. Jenkins pressed her face closer to the window, her glasses fogging up a little. "I knew it," she whispered. "Karen's finally gone too far." Mr. Carter nodded, stepping farther out onto his porch. "About time someone stopped her," he said under his breath. Little Timmy clapped his hands, bouncing up and down. "This is better than TV," he squeaked. They'd all had enough of Karen's bossy ways, and now something was happening, something they'd never expected. Karen's voice got louder again, but it wasn't strong anymore. It was shaky, like she wasn't sure what to say. "This is a mistake," she cried, waving her phone at the officers. "I'm the good guy here. He's the one with the ugly rug. Tell him to take it down." She pointed at Jake one more time, her arm swinging wild. But the officers didn't even turn their heads. They kept their eyes on her, steady and quiet. Jake chuckled, a soft, low sound that only he could hear. He set his mug down again and folded his hands in his lap. He looked at Karen, then at the officers, then back at Karen. That grin on his face said it all. He knew what was coming, and it was going to be good. That little detail he'd noticed. It was like a key turning in a lock, opening up a door Karen didn't even know was there. And now the cops were here, standing in front of her, ready to walk through it. What do you think Jake saw? What was the little thing Karen missed that flipped this whole day upside down? Stick around, because this story's heating up, and the big surprise is right around the corner. The two police officers stood right in front of Karen Wilson, their boots planted firm on the sidewalk. Their faces were serious like teachers about to give a big timeout. The tall one with short brown hair looked straight at her, his eyes steady and calm. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep and clear, "we're not here about a rug. We're here about you." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and the whole street went silent. No birds chirping, no breeze rustling the leaves, just quiet. Everyone held their breath, waiting to see what happened next. Karen's jaw dropped. Her mouth fell open so wide you could see her teeth, and her eyes got big like saucers. Her phone slipped a little in her hand, almost falling to the ground, but she caught it just in time. She blinked fast, like she couldn't believe what she'd heard. "Me," she stammered, her voice all shaky and high. "What are you talking about? I didn't do anything. I called you. I'm the good guy here." She waved her phone at the officers, then pointed at Jake Miller, who was still sitting on his porch. "It's him. He's the one with the ugly rug. Tell him to take it down." The officers didn't move. They didn't look at Jake or his little blue rug. They just kept staring at Karen, their faces blank and serious. The taller one tilted his head a tiny bit, like he was waiting for her to stop talking. The bigger one with the shaved head crossed his arms, standing like a wall. They weren't here to play games, and Karen was starting to figure that out. Her face was turning redder than a big, ripe tomato, and her hands started to shake. She didn't know what was happening, but it wasn't going her way. Not one bit. That's when Jake stood up. Slow and easy, like he had all the time in the world. He pushed himself out of his comfy porch chair, stretching his legs as he got to his feet. He didn't rush or huff or puff. He was casual as ever, like he was just standing up to grab more coffee. But then, oh boy, then he reached into his pocket. His hand went in, and when it came out, he was holding something shiny. Something small but important. A badge. Yep, a real, honest-to-goodness police badge. It gleamed in the sunlight, all silver and bright, with little words etched into it that said he was a cop. The neighbors gasped. Mrs. Jenkins dropped her curtain, her hands flying to her mouth. Mr. Carter's jaw fell open, and he leaned forward on his porch railing. Little Timmy squealed, "No way," from his window, his voice bouncing down the street. Everyone's eyes went wide, staring at Jake like he'd just turned into a superhero. Karen froze, her phone still in her hand, her fingers still pointing at him. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She just stood there, like a statue made of shock. Jake held up the badge so everyone could see it. He turned it a little, letting it catch the light. Then he looked at Karen, his voice steady and calm. "I've been keeping an eye on things around here," he said, not loud, not mean, just clear. "Turns out, Karen, you've been harassing folks for months. People have been complaining about you, lots of people. They've told me stories, and I've got the reports to prove it. All written down, nice and neat." He paused for a second, letting that sink in. Then he grinned a little, just a tiny bit. "That call you just made to 911? Over my rug? That was the last straw." The street exploded with noise, not loud noise, but little gasps and whispers everywhere. Mrs. Jenkins clapped her hands together, whispering, "I knew it. I knew she was trouble." Mr. Carter laughed a big, deep laugh that echoed off his house. "Well, I'll be," he said, shaking his head. Little Timmy jumped up and down, shouting, "Jake's a cop! Jake's a cop!" The neighbors couldn't believe it. All this time, quiet Jake Miller wasn't just some guy sipping coffee on his porch. He was an off-duty cop, watching everything, keeping track of what Karen was up to. Karen's face went from red to purple. She looked like she might pop, her cheeks puffing out as she tried to find words. "What?" she finally yelled, her voice cracking. "You're a cop? No way. That's not true. You're lying." She shook her head fast, her hair flapping around. "I'm the HOA president. I make the rules. You can't do this to me." She waved her phone again, like it could save her, but it didn't do a thing. The officers stepped closer, and she took a step back, her sneakers squeaking on the sidewalk. Jake didn't yell back. He didn't need to. He just stood there, holding his badge, looking at her with that steady gaze. "I've been watching you for a while, Karen," he said. "Every time you yelled at someone, every time you made a big fuss over nothing, I wrote it down. People came to me quietly, so you wouldn't know. They told me how you've been bossing them around, scaring them, making them miserable. I've got a whole stack of complaints at the station. And that 911 call you just made? That was silly. You can't call the police over a rug. That's not an emergency. It's against the rules, real rules, not your HOA ones." The taller officer nodded. "That's right," he said, speaking up for the first time. "We got a call from dispatch about a lady misusing 911. Said she's been a problem for a while. We were already on our way here when you dialed, ma'am. This isn't about a rug. It's about you." He pointed at Karen, his finger steady, and she flinched like he'd poked her. Karen's mouth opened and closed, like a fish out of water. But she stammered, looking from the officers to Jake and back again. "I didn't do anything wrong. I'm helping the neighborhood. He's the one breaking rules." She pointed at Jake one more time, but it was weak now, like she didn't even believe herself. Her hands dropped to her sides, and her phone dangled there, useless. She was running out of steam, and everyone could see it. Jake slipped his badge back into his pocket, nice and slow. "I've lived here for years, Karen," he said. "I like it quiet. I like it friendly. But you've been making it loud and mean. People are tired of it. I'm tired of it. So I started watching. I listened when Mrs. Jenkins said you yelled at her about her flowers. I wrote it down when Mr. Carter told me you threatened to fine him over his trash can. Even little Timmy said you shut down his lemonade stand for no good reason. You've been picking on everyone, and I've got it all on paper." The neighbors started nodding. Mrs. Jenkins called out from her window, "That's right. She told me my roses were too red." Mr. Carter chimed in, "She said my trash can was an eyesore, but it's just a can." Little Timmy's voice squeaked, "She took my lemonade money." They were all talking now, their voices mixing together, telling the officers what Karen had done. It was like a dam breaking. Everything they'd kept quiet about came rushing out. Karen spun around, looking at them all. "Stop it," she shouted, her voice cracking again. "You can't talk about me like that. I'm in charge here. I keep this place nice." But no one was listening to her anymore. The officers stepped closer, and the taller one pulled out a little notebook from his pocket. He flipped it open, reading something, then looked at Karen. "We've got multiple reports of harassment," he said. "And now misuse of emergency services. That's serious, ma'am." Jake crossed his arms, standing tall on his porch. "I didn't want to do this, Karen," he said. "I like keeping things peaceful. But you wouldn't stop. You kept pushing, and now here we are." He nodded at the officers, like he was giving them the go-ahead. That little blue rug was still there, sitting quiet on the porch floor, but it wasn't the problem anymore. Karen was. Her face crumpled. She looked around at Jake, at the officers, at the neighbors watching her. "This isn't fair," she cried, stomping her foot. "I'm the victim. He tricked me." But the officers weren't buying it. The bigger one stepped forward, reaching for something on his belt. "Ma'am," he said, "we need you to come with us. We'll sort this out at the station." The neighbors cheered soft at first, then louder. Mrs. Jenkins clapped her hands, smiling big. Mr. Carter pumped his fist in the air. Little Timmy yelled, "Yeah, Jake," from his window. Karen's eyes darted around, wild and scared. She didn't know Jake was a cop. She didn't know he'd been watching her every move, collecting proof of all the mean things she'd done. She thought he was just a quiet guy with a rug and nobody she could boss around. But she was wrong. Oh, she was so wrong. Jake stayed on his porch, watching it all. His grin was gone now, but his eyes were bright. He'd dropped the big reveal, and it hit like a thunderclap. Karen's world was flipping upside down, and he'd made it happen not with yelling or fighting, but with smarts and patience. How's that for a twist? The guy she thought she could scare was the one who'd been keeping the neighborhood safe all along. The police officers didn't mess around. They stood tall in front of Karen Wilson, their faces serious and their eyes sharp. The taller one, with the short brown hair, stepped forward just a little. He looked right at her and said, "Karen Wilson, you're under arrest." His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, but it wasn't mean, just firm, like a teacher telling you to sit down. "You're in trouble for misuse of emergency services and harassment." Those were big words, but they meant simple things. Karen had called 911 when she shouldn't have, and she'd been picking on people too much. Way too much. Karen's eyes got huge, like two big round marbles popping out of her head. Her mouth opened, and she started shouting right away. "No. You can't do this," she yelled, her voice loud and squeaky. "I have rights. I'm the HOA president. I didn't do anything wrong." She waved her arms around, her bright red shirt flapping like a flag in the wind. Her phone was still in her hand, and she shook it at the officers like it could stop them. "This is my neighborhood. I make the rules. You've got the wrong person." She kept going, her words tumbling out fast and wild, like she was trying to talk her way out of it. But the officers weren't having it. Not today. The bigger one, with the shaved head, shook his head just a little. "Ma'am," he said, calm and steady, "you need to stop talking now." He reached down to his belt and pulled out a pair of shiny silver handcuffs. They jingled in his hand, catching the sunlight. Karen saw them, and her face went pale for a second, then red again, even redder than before. "Handcuffs," she screeched. "You can't put those on me. I'm not a criminal. I'm the good guy here." She took a step back, her sneakers squeaking on the sidewalk, but there was nowhere to go. The officers were right there, and they meant business. The taller officer stepped closer, holding up one hand to calm her down. "We've got reports," he said. "Lots of them. People say you've been bothering them for months, yelling, threatening, making trouble. And that 911 call you just made? That was wrong. You can't call the police over a rug. That's not what emergencies are for." He nodded at his partner, and the bigger officer moved in. Before Karen could say another word, he grabbed her wrists gentle but strong and clicked the handcuffs on. One snap, then another. The metal locked around her hands, holding them tight together. Karen screamed. "No. Let me go. This isn't fair." She twisted and turned, trying to pull her arms free, but the cuffs didn't budge. The officers held her steady, one on each side, and started walking her toward their police car. Her feet dragged a little, her shoes scraping the ground, but they kept moving. She shouted the whole way. "I'll sue you. I'll tell the HOA. You can't do this to me." Her voice bounced off the houses, loud and angry, but it didn't change a thing. The officers didn't even flinch. They'd heard it all before, and they knew what they had to do. Jake Miller stood on his porch, watching it all happen. His little blue rug was still there, right where he'd put it, sitting quiet and harmless on the floor. He leaned against the railing, his arms crossed, and a tiny smile played on his lips. He didn't say much, just watched as the officers marched Karen past his house. Her red shirt glowed in the sunlight, and her face was a mix of mad and scared. She glared at Jake as she went by, her eyes like little daggers. "This is your fault," she snapped at him. "You tricked me. You and that stupid rug." But Jake didn't answer. He just tipped his head a little, like he was saying goodbye. The police car was parked right in front of Jake's house, its doors already open. The officers guided Karen to the back seat, one of them putting a hand on her head so she wouldn't bump it as she got in. She kept yelling, even as they sat her down. "I'm not the bad guy. He is. Get me out of here." Her voice was muffled a little once the door shut, but you could still hear her through the window. The taller officer climbed into the driver's seat, and the bigger one walked around to the other side. They didn't rush, they moved slow and sure, like this was just another day for them. The car started up with a soft rumble. The engine purred, and the tires rolled as it pulled away from the curb. Karen's face pressed against the window, her nose squishing on the glass. She was still shouting, but the words were hard to make out now, just a jumble of noise fading away. The neighbors watched the car go, their eyes following it down the street until it turned the corner and disappeared. The street went quiet again, like someone had flipped a switch. No more yelling, no more clomping shoes, just the soft chirp of birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Jake turned around, away from the empty street, and faced the neighbors. They weren't hiding anymore. Mrs. Jenkins had opened her front door and stepped out, her hands clasped together like she was praying. Mr. Carter was on his porch, leaning on the railing with a big grin. Little Timmy ran out into his yard, jumping up and down like he'd just won a prize. And then it started clapping. Soft at first, just a few hands coming together, but it grew louder and louder. Cheers mixed in, happy shouts and whistles bouncing around. "Way to go, Jake!" Mrs. Jenkins called. "You did it!" Mr. Carter added, pumping his fist. "Finally!" Timmy yelled, spinning in a circle. Jake raised a hand, waving at them all. His smile got a little bigger, and he winked one quick flash of his eye. "Guess the neighborhood's gonna be a little quieter now," he said, his voice easy and warm. The neighbors laughed, nodding their heads. They liked that idea a lot. For months, Karen had been the loudest thing around, stomping up and down the street, barking orders, making everyone jump. But now, she was gone, tucked away in that police car, and the air felt lighter already. The little blue rug stayed right where it was. Jake didn't move it, didn't touch it. It sat there on his porch, soft and simple, like a quiet little trophy. He'd won not with shouting or fighting, but with smarts and patience. Karen had thought she could boss him around, just like she did with everyone else. She'd thought that rug was her big chance to show him who was in charge. But she was wrong. Oh, she was so wrong. That rug wasn't going anywhere, and Karen wasn't bossing anyone around anymore. Let's take a step back and look at what just happened. The police car was gone, and the street was calm again. The sun still shone bright, painting everything gold. Jake's house looked the same as always, small and cozy, with its white walls and red roof. His porch chair was empty now, the coffee mug sitting on the little table beside it. The neighbors were still out, talking to each other now, their voices happy and free. Mrs. Jenkins walked over to Mr. Carter's porch, her slippers shuffling on the grass. "I can't believe it," she said, shaking her head. "Jake's a cop? And Karen's finally gone." Mr. Carter nodded, his grin stretching wide. "About time," he said. "She's been a pain forever. Remember when she told me my trash can was too loud when I rolled it out? Too loud. It's a can." Mrs. Jenkins laughed, a big, happy sound. "Oh, and my roses. She said they were too bright for the neighborhood. Can you believe that?" They kept talking, swapping stories about all the silly things Karen had done. Little Timmy ran up, his sneakers kicking up dirt. "She took my lemonade money," he said, waving his arms. But Jake stopped her. "He's awesome." Jake could hear them from his porch. He didn't join in, he just listened, leaning on the railing. The neighbors were happy, and that made him happy too. He'd lived here for years, keeping to himself, watching the world go by. He liked it quiet, liked it friendly. But Karen had made it loud and mean, and he'd had enough. So he'd done something about it, not with noise, but with a plan. He'd kept his badge hidden, kept his job a secret, and waited. He'd listened when people complained, written it all down, and built a case. And now, it was over. Justice was served, simple as that. The street felt different now. Lighter, freer, like a big weight had been lifted off everyone's shoulders. Kids started coming outside again, their bikes whirring as they rode up and down. A dog barked down the block, a happy bark, not a scared one. The birds chirped louder, like they were celebrating too. Jake looked out at it all, his eyes soft. He'd done his job not just as a cop, but as a neighbor. He'd made things right. Karen. She was on her way to the police station, sitting in the back of that car. She wasn't in charge anymore. No more marching around with her rulebook, no more yelling at people over silly things. She'd pushed too far, and it caught up with her. That 911 call about Jake's rug had been the last straw, the one that broke her big, loud camel's back. Now she'd have to answer for it, and the neighborhood could breathe easy again. Jake walked over to his chair and sat back down. He picked up his coffee mug, but it was cold now. He didn't mind. He set it back down and leaned back, stretching his arms out. The rug was still there, right under his feet, soft and blue. It hadn't moved, hadn't changed. It was just a rug, but to Karen, it had been a war. A war she'd lost. Jake chuckled to himself, a quiet little laugh. He didn't need to say much. The cheers from the neighbors said it all. Mrs. Jenkins called out again, waving at him. "Jake, you're a hero," she said, her voice full of thanks. Mr. Carter nodded. "Best neighbor ever," he shouted. Timmy ran up to the edge of Jake's yard, holding up a thumbs up. "You're the coolest, Jake," he yelled, grinning big. Jake waved back, his hand slow and easy. "Just doing my part," he said, simple and true. The day went on, and the neighborhood settled down. People went back to their houses, but they kept smiling. They kept talking about what had happened, about Jake's badge, about Karen's arrest, about the little blue rug that started it all. It was a story they'd tell for a long time, a story that made them laugh and cheer. Karen was gone, and peace was back. That's what mattered. Jake stayed on his porch a while longer, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. The breeze blew soft, the birds sang sweet, and everything felt right. He'd stood up for his neighbors, and they'd stood up for him. The rug stayed put, a quiet little reminder that sometimes the smallest things can make the biggest difference. And Karen? She wasn't coming back to boss anyone anytime soon. So there it was, justice served, plain and simple. The bad guy lost, the good guy won, and the neighborhood got its quiet back. How's that for a happy ending? What do you think happens next? Stick around, because this story's got one more piece to tell. So, there you have it, friends. What a wild ride that was, right? Karen Wilson thought she was the big boss, stomping around the neighborhood like she owned every house, every yard, every little blade of grass. She thought she could push anyone around, especially Jake Miller, that quiet guy with the little blue rug on his porch. She thought he was just some nobody, someone she could yell at and scare into doing what she wanted. But oh boy, was she wrong. Sometimes the person you think you can boss turns out to be the one pulling all the strings. And Karen? She learned that the hard way. Let's think about it for a minute. Karen was loud, super loud. She had that big voice that made dogs hide and kids run inside. She carried her HOA rulebook like it was a crown, waving it at everyone, telling them what to do. She thought she was in charge, thought she could make Jake take down his rug just because she didn't like it. She even called the police over it. Can you believe that? A rug. She was so sure she'd win, so sure Jake would back down. But Jake? He didn't yell. He didn't fight. He didn't even get mad. He just sat there, sipping his coffee, smiling that little smile. Why? Because he had a secret, a big one. He was a cop, and he'd been watching her all along. That's the cool thing about Jake. He didn't need to shout to win. He didn't need to stomp his feet or wave a rule book. He was quiet, but he was smart. He listened to the neighbors when they complained about Karen. He wrote it all down, every mean thing she did, every time she picked on someone. He waited, patient as can be, until the right moment came. And when it did, boom. He showed his badge, and everything flipped upside down. Karen went from bossing to begging, and Jake? He just stood there, calm and steady, proving you don't need a loud voice to be strong. So, what's the big lesson here? It's simple, you don't have to be the loudest person in the room to be the toughest. Sometimes the quiet ones, the ones who don't make a fuss, are the ones with the real power. Karen thought Jake was weak because he didn't argue back. She thought she could push him around because he didn't shout. But she didn't see what was really going on. Jake wasn't weak, he was waiting. He was watching. He was ready. And when the time was right, he showed everyone who he really was. That's pretty awesome, don't you think? Now, let's talk about you for a second. Have you ever had a moment like that? A time when someone thought they could boss you around, but you turned it all around on them? Maybe it was a bully at school who kept picking on you, but one day you stood up and surprised them. Or maybe it was a friend who thought they knew everything, but you showed them you had your own way of doing things. Or maybe it was something small like winning a game when everyone thought you'd lose. Those moments feel good, don't they? They're like little victories, times when you prove you're stronger than people think. I'd love to hear your stories. Down in the comments, tell me about a time when you turned the tables on someone like Jake did with Karen. Did you surprise them? Did you stay calm and win without yelling? I bet you've got some great tales to share, and I can't wait to read them. It's fun to think about, right? We all have a little Jake inside us, someone who can be quiet but still come out on top. Let's look back at the neighborhood for a minute. After the police took Karen away, everything changed. The street got quiet again, not a scared quiet, but a happy quiet. Kids came out to play, riding their bikes and laughing. Neighbors waved to each other, smiling big. The birds sang louder, like they were happy too. And Jake? He just sat back down on his porch, his little blue rug still there, soft and simple. He didn't need to say much. The neighbors cheered for him, calling him a hero, and that was enough. He'd made things right, and everyone knew it. That's another cool thing to think about. Jake didn't do this for himself. He didn't show his badge to look big or cool. He did it for everyone, for Mrs. Jenkins and her roses, for Mr. Carter and his trash can, for little Timmy and his lemonade stand. He saw how Karen was making people sad and mad, and he decided to fix it. He used his power, the power of being a cop, to help his friends. That's what real heroes do, isn't it? They don't just fight for themselves, they fight for the people around them. So, what can we learn from Jake? Maybe it's this: being strong doesn't mean being loud. Being brave doesn't mean making a big show. Sometimes it's the quiet stuff, listening, waiting, helping, that makes the biggest difference. Karen thought power was all about shouting and rules, but Jake showed her it's about something else. It's about knowing who you are and using that to do good. Pretty neat, huh? Let's imagine what might happen next. With Karen gone, the neighborhood could be whatever the people wanted it to be. Maybe they'd have a big party to celebrate cookies and lemonade for everyone, with Timmy running the stand again. Maybe they'd plant more flowers, bright ones like Mrs. Jenkins liked, without anyone yelling about them. Maybe Jake would keep sitting on his porch, watching it all with that little smile, knowing he'd helped make it happen. The little blue rug would stay right there, a quiet little reminder that sometimes the smallest things can start the biggest changes. Now, I want you to think about your own life. Are there people like Karen around you, bossy folks who think they're in charge? Or maybe there's a Jake, someone quiet who surprises you with how strong they are. Look around, because you never know who's got a secret up their sleeve. And hey, maybe you're the Jake in your story. Maybe you're the one who's quiet now but ready to stand up when it counts. That's a pretty cool thought, isn't it? Before I go, let me say this: if you like this story, give it a big thumbs up. It's fun to share tales like this, and I've got more where that came from. Hit that subscribe button too, so you don't miss the next one. Because in this world, you never know who's got a surprise waiting, just like Jake did. Stories like this remind us that things aren't always what they seem, and that's what makes them so exciting. Let's wrap it up with one last idea. Think about the people you meet every day. Some of them might seem loud and big, like Karen, but that doesn't mean they're the strongest. And some might be quiet, like Jake, but they've got power you can't see right away. It's like a treasure hunt, figuring out who's who and what they can do. So keep your eyes open, stay kind, and don't be afraid to be the quiet one who wins in the end. You've got that strength inside you, just waiting for the right moment to shine. So, what do you say? Tell me your stories in the comments, I really want to hear them. Where are you watching from today? And have you ever turned the tables on someone like Jake did? Let's talk about it. This world's full of surprises, and I bet you've got some good ones to share. Thanks for sticking with me, and I'll see you in the next story. Because who knows? The next big twist might be just around the corner.